rest of you would like to mute yourselves just to make sure, and we can do Q&A at the end. Okay, everyone, so welcome to the Irish American Heritage Museum. Our virtual lecture series continues, and we are absolutely delighted to have with us, he's over in Ireland, so apologies to him for the late start, but we have Padraig Mahoney, or Mahoney, with us at the moment. He is a Casperson Fellow in History and Culture at Drew University, and he's a former Fulbright Scholar at the National University of Ireland in Galway. And he just told me there he's working sometimes with the University at Maynooth, so he does a lot of work in the Irish language, so obviously he'll be slipping back and forth between the Gaw-Changa, both tongues. His writings have been, of course, published in both Irish and English, and most recently his story, Cuivne na Killa, is that Memories of the Graveyard?
It's actually Memories of the Cell.
Of the Cell, okay, yeah. Was awarded first prize in the Manchester Irish Language Short Story Competition. He is the co-author of From a Land Beyond the Wave, Connecticut's Irish Rebels, 1798 to 1916, which won the Connecticut League of History Organization's Publication Prize in 2018. And tonight he's going to speak to us about a fascinating topic and his new book. So this is the life of 19th century Limerick immigrant Eoin Ua Cathail, whose writings were published for the first time in this bilingual volume. And so Padraig has been able to kind of gather these writings and publish them. The man himself, Owen, was in the southwestern and upper midwestern United States and harnessed the richness of the Irish language to describe a wide range of topics, from clashes with Native American tribes, a chance encounter with a runaway slave, and he discusses the environmental impact of the midwestern timber industry, as well as the emergence of the Gaelic Revival. And I gave a talk a while ago about the Gaelic Revival here in the Gaelic League and efforts by Irish people coming out to fundraise for that. So it's interesting how much of the Irish language work took place actually in America, particularly in the late 19th century. So Padraig, fáilte go dtí an museum, we're delighted to have you. Gurv míle maith, thank you for being here, and you can take it away, I hope.
So gurv míle maith, I guess. Dús bara just bhfuil muíchas occur nu Elizabeth, as an deis seo bheilh anacht go háirithe agus mé caint scéal an cailg agus an cruúiseach nua chur mé le chéile le Jenny dar Tigil, Recovering an Irish Voice from the American Frontier, the Prose Writings of Eoin Ua Cathail. So thanks a million. It's always great to visit Albany this time of year, even digitally tonight, from the wilds of County Louth here on the border. And I suppose I just want to give kind of three insights into Eoin Ua Cathail. And the first, I think, is quite obvious, of who was Eoin Ua Cathail, and why is he a significant figure in terms of kind of Irish emigrants of the 19th century, and what was he writing about? As Elizabeth mentioned there, he, I suppose, harnessed the richness of the Irish language to describe his experiences in the United States, but then also what literary genres of the time was he tapping into, right? To kind of experiment, with literary forms to kind of put these stories across. And then thirdly, I think that kind of leads naturally to Owen's relationship with the Irish language, and kind of focusing on that question of why did he choose to write in Irish, and how did he gain the proficiency? Spoiler alert here, he wasn't a native speaker of Irish. So I'll just kind of outline how he came to kind of develop his skills in the Irish language to produce these stories that are contained in the volume. And just a quick spoiler alert for those who haven't gotten their paws on a copy of the book yet. I'm going to talk about some of the specific stories tonight in the course of my presentation. So if you want to remain in suspense and totally in the dark of what these tales are about, you can log off now and come back in about 45 minutes for a pint and some questions and answers. I'm only joking about that because I don't know how great the numbers are this evening. So don't log off. You can have a pint during the presentation, and it might make it a bit more interesting as well. But I'll begin with that natural kind of question of who was Eoin Ua Cathail? And we see him here, but his story begins in 1840 in Inchawan in Temple Glenton in West Limerick. And he's one of 6 children who survived adulthood. And he emigrates to the United States at the age of 23 in 1863. And like many other families in the west of Ireland at this time, and even beforehand and afterwards as well, I suppose the kind of constant gnawing pull of emigration had a profound impact upon the O'Cahill family. With the exception of a younger brother, Morris, who died in infancy, all 5 of O'Cahill's siblings emigrated to the United States. So I'll just kind of run through now, I suppose, what happened to those siblings and where they ended up in order to just give a bit of context of Owen O'Cahill's kind of spatiality in the United States, right? Because he would have been in kind of constant contact with his siblings. So first, his older brother, Pádraig O'Cahill, actually precedes him going to the US, and he settles in a town called Pentwater, Michigan. And Pentwater is actually where Owen ends up spending the majority of his adult life. And Pádraig's very interesting, I suppose, from a historical kind of point of view in putting this story together, and that he kind of fades off the historical record. The only, I suppose, insight that we have into his life is from an oral history that Owen's daughter Charlotte produces. And it says that he died in a US military old soldiers home after a period of poor health. So we know that he probably served in the military. Military records show, a large number of individuals that would fit the name of Pádraig O'Cahill or Patrick Cahill or Cahill. But he's kind of he's not a central character in any of Owen's stories, so he's kind of a periphery, on the periphery in that sense. Meanwhile, though, their sister Honora becomes a school teacher and settled in Washington, D.C., and this is important for a reason which I'll tell you in a moment, while 3 younger sisters went further west. Elizabeth ended up in Dallas, Texas, not far from the University of North Texas Press, which put out the volume, so it was great for that. His sister Bridget ends up in Chicago, and Bridget is the only one of O'Cahill's siblings who actually does feature in his short stories. He's a frequent visitor to his sister, and we know that from his private letters as well. And he himself lives for a time in Chicago, which I'll cover in a moment. And the youngest sister, Catherine, ends up first near the Mexican border in Douglas, Arizona, and she later relocates to Denver, Colorado. And I'll just go to a slide here so you can see a few pictures of his family. And this kind of striking woman that we see at the top here is actually Catherine's daughter, which some of you might know if you're interested in the history of Broadway and film, early film. Her name is Florence Johns, and she actually died fairly recently, 1986, in Newtown, Connecticut. So that's only a couple of years before I was born, so it's really not too long ago, we'll say. And she is quite popular as an early screen actress, and she's a writer as well. So if anybody's ever seen the film Registered Nurse, which came out in 1934, she actually wrote the original stage play for that. And she's credited on the film as one of the writers. And a good chunk of the kind of correspondences that we have from Owen O'Cahill are actually his correspondences with his niece, Florence Johns. He kept up a warm correspondence with her, and they discussed a wide range of topics, but mostly family history. He's quite proud of his kind of genealogical background. In the bottom corner here, we see the elusive Pádraig O'Cahill on the far left with his kind of paddy cap and pipe. And Owen is actually seated, let's just see if I can move this. He's seated right in the middle with his bowler cap on. So, the lad's enjoying a sunny afternoon in Michigan and during the summer and dressed to kill for the occasion. You can't blame him. And then the last picture we have here is actually the O'Cahill family farm outside of Pentwater, Michigan. And there's Owen and his family standing in front. And just an interesting note on this, because he actually explains to Florence Johns in one of his letters, and it's noted elsewhere as well, that he named his house in Pentwater Blarney House. And this is owing to the fact that Owen was extremely proud of being a maternal descendant of the McCarthy clan of Blarney Castle. And he has kind of a little family history drawn up as well, but obviously that was something that he took particular pride in. So just going back here, to the man himself, to Owen. Just to note, I suppose, that his life was at times, in putting this work together, quite difficult to piece together. And this was owing largely to his seamless ability, really, to blend fact and fiction within his writings. This was so much so the case one afternoon last spring during the first lockdown that I reached an absolute dead end when trying to kind of chase up some of the claims that he made in one of his particular accounts. And so in what can only be described as really an act of desperation, or a Hail Mary, if you want to say that, I sent a message to the Temple Glenton Parish Facebook page. And I asked if they had any records on the family, or even better, if there were any descendants still living in the area. And I had an idea, in fairness, that there might have been some descendants still living around Temple Gletton, because Eoin Ua Cathail was actually married 5 times. And one of those marriages was before he left Ireland, and he left a couple of children. So luckily for me, within an hour, maybe an hour and a half, I was in touch with Owen's great, I think, granddaughter, Breach. And she was an absolute fountain of knowledge about her family history. And she also put me in touch with a cousin of hers who was actually Owen's direct granddaughter from a later marriage, who lives in California. And like Breach, this cousin Mary was a fountain of knowledge about her family history, and also contained a load of personal papers of Owen's, which she kindly provided me. So it was only at this stage that Owen's kind of, I suppose, a more clear picture of Owen's life came into focus. So working on that information, we see that after emigrating to New York at the height of the Civil War, even a cursory glance at that year, 1863, in American history sees the height of the American Civil War, Owen didn't go the route, though, of many of his countrymen and enroll in the ongoing conflict. Instead, he made for Washington, D.C. to join his sister Honora, who was already established. And it was through a childhood friend who had also settled in D.C., James L. Roach, that he procures a job in the Quartermaster General's Department, who at the time were responsible for barracks and quarters, supplying transportation of military personnel and materials, and procurement and distribution of most classes of military supplies. So in 1865, through his kind of work in the Quartermaster General's Department, he's sent to Little Rock, Arkansas in the Southwest. And that's where I suppose we see in these stories that his kind of creative development really takes root. And it's actually within a year that he's forced to resign his position from the department for an undisclosed illness or injury. And it very well might have been malaria, because O'Connell suffered health problems for the remainder of his life. And there's a letter that he wrote into on Clive Solish, the organ of the Gaelic League, where he talks about the effects of malaria. So it very well could have been that. But, and I'll talk about this a bit later, it's during his kind of recuperation process that he begins writing. And then for the most part, he spends the rest of his life in the upper Midwestern US, as Elizabeth mentioned, mainly in Pentwater, Michigan, where his brother Pat had settled years before. So from here, census records provide a pretty clear picture of his professional life after 1870. He had a brief stint as a patrolman with the Chicago Police Department from 1873 to 76, and that's the picture we see here on the left. And that's the Chicago Police Patrolman's badge that he's wearing there. That caused no end of confusion for some early readers of the book as to why there was a Star of David on his coat, but it's patrolman's badge. And after his brief stint from 73 to 76, which he actually resigns for health reasons. So again, he never fully recovered from whatever that illness was in 1865. He returns then to Pentwater, Michigan, and opens up and operates a saloon in the town between 1880 and 1900. And I think this is significant for one reason. In O'Connell's kind of early writings, where he's describing his life in West Limerick as a kid, he very much taps into the oral tradition, the oral kind of Gaelic tradition of West Limerick. And he talks about the profound impact that it had upon him as a child and even moving forward, in which neighbors might call to the house. They had a repertoire of stories that they had memorized, and they would go and kind of tell these stories around. And in turn, then some individuals like Owen would then memorize those same stories, and they would become part of his repertoire. So in Owen's case, he actually transcribes some of these stories as well, and they're also contained in the Douglas Hyde papers. So I can only imagine, if you think of the 19th century United States in these kind of towns that are quickly becoming cities, some of the central kind of social points are, saloons. So he'd be a great proprietor for anybody coming in to get a drink, to give them a story. But then also in 1888, he opens up, and I think this is still the case in the United States and certainly in Ireland as well, another social hub, the barbershop. He opens up a barbershop in the town, seeking to kind of build his business acumen in Pentwater. But this venture doesn't really work out for him. It leaves him almost completely financially destitute when a fire ravages the west end of Pentwater's main street that same year in 1888. So O'Cahill, unfortunately, his business was not insured, and he suffers an astronomical sum of 700 quid in damages. And that's about $20,000 US dollars today. So a massive amount for a working class Irish immigrant at the time. And he's forced to close both his pub and his barber shop. And then he becomes a dairy farmer and moves kind of outside of the town. And at various times, and this is something that's described in his stories, he works as the surveyor in the booming lumber trade of the upper Midwest. And that's really when he needs money, he kind of dusts off that skill of his and goes out into the woods for surveying. But as I mentioned, before, much of what we know about Eoin Ua Cathail, aside from kind of familial or official state records, comes from his own writings, which can be, a problem historically at times. I think it can be said he was prolific with the pen, and wrote a number of poems and short stories, as well as private letters and editorials, which, when I say poems, not just short ditties, his poems, and we see just an image here of one on the left, these were epic kind of 500 stanza poems in the old oceanic style of Irish myth. And he's adapting stories of the American West to these forms of oceanic poetry. And I'll go back to that in a moment, and kind of talk about where that influence to even tap into Irish myth came from and adapt the American West to Irish myth. But he also talks about a number of kind of political and cultural developments of the time, including the Gaelic Revival, both in the United States and in Ireland, the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, and even the election of President McKinley, who he was a supporter of, the outbreak of World War I. And he lamented the fact that the United States didn't enter the war first, or they didn't enter the war earlier, because he thought that it could have brought a premature end to World War I. He was very much an American nationalist in many ways. And he also, I suppose, addresses the sinking of the Lusitania, which he thought was absolutely reprehensible as well. So it's fascinating to see, I suppose, him address all of these topics through the medium of the Irish language. However, these letters, which were mostly actually sent to the renowned scholar, Gaelic League founder, and later first president of Ireland, Douglas Hyde, are also striking, I would say, for their omissions, right? So he mentions all those things about World War I and the Spanish-American War, and he talks about Irish politics to a degree as well, but O'Cahill makes no mention of the Easter Rising, even when he's writing immediately after it, and the whole of Irish America is talking about it, or the subsequent Tan War. So I think that, I suppose we can definitely say that Eoin Ua Cathail in an Irish context is very much a nationalist. And he's obviously very much in line with kind of cultural nationalism, and even kind of the politics of kind of the home rulers. But he's more of a nationalist than a Republican in the Irish sense. That being said, I suppose he very much appreciated the kind of dichotomy of mid-19th century America, which championed, right, American republicanism, democratic republicanism, against these kind of old world forms of European politics, of monarchies and aristocracies. And just to give you a kind of a fun anecdote from O'Cahill's time working in the Quartermaster General's Department, it's that, I suppose, and I have this in the introduction to the book, but when he first arrived in the country and he's working in Washington, D.C., he was said to be walking down the street one day and he happened upon Abraham Lincoln. And as the story goes, Abraham Lincoln tips his kind of trademark top hat to the fresh-faced immigrant and kind of says, good day to you. And O'Cahill turns to a mate who he's walking down the street with and says, imagine the King of England doing that. So it just kind of speaks to this kind of stark right? Difference between the politics of the old world that he came from and the politics of the new world. It's kind of symbolic enough in that way. However, it's O'Cahill's stories, kind of written as short stories that are the most enduring value, I think, to both the general public and scholars alike. And these actually comprise the majority of this, what's in this volume. So his stories are all based, as I mentioned, on his experiences, either working for the Quartermaster General's office or just generally set in the Southwest, or while living and working in the upper Midwest. But they're also a blend of popular genres in American literature of the time, notably the frontier narrative and more recently to his time, the dime novel. So I'm sure we have at least a couple of dime novel readers here, maybe. I've been known to dabble myself from time to time, and especially while putting this together, I read quite a few dime novels just to kind of have a consistency of language of what was being written at the time that he was writing himself in English. But for those who mightn't be aware of the early origins of the genre, it came about around the same time that O'Cahill arrived as a young immigrant in the United States. So perhaps unsurprisingly, it gets its name for the cheap price of these texts and probably the cheap price of production of the text as well. They were cranked out, often anonymous writers writing multiple stories and just kind of cranking dozens of stories out in short periods of time. And they could be easily had for a few cents in your local dry goods shop, your local corner store, news agents, wherever you were doing your shop for the week. And they quickly become a staple, particularly of working class literature, first in the United States, but then really around the world as well, with stories told in descriptive, straightforward language with formulaic plots and characters. Of course, some of the recurring heroes of these tales rose up to international stardom, based on their purported exploits, most notably Buffalo Bill Cody and Kit Carson. And on that note of Cody, and his kind of story is inextricably linked with O'Cahill's, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But I think we have to think about, when we think about the dime novel, the issue of spatiality as well, right? Because they're particularly popular within the kind of urban hubs of places like the northeastern United States. And there's an element, one could say, of escapism in these stories. They're seeing exotic landscapes, exotic wildlife, some could say even exotic situations like we see here in this Buffalo Bill repage cover of exotic wildlife and even Native Americans, interactions with Native Americans, whether it be conflicts or later on sometimes, and this is certainly true in O'Cahill's case, kind of hunting trips with Native allies. But these are situations that, or environments which most of these urban readers would never encounter in their lifetime. So there's definitely a level of escapism within these tales for their readership. But it's worth noting that both of these genres, the frontier narrative and the dime novel, had already reached their peak by the time that Eoin O'Cahill was writing in the early 20th century. In the American market, stories of Indian attacks had already given way to new interests in outlaws, robbers, bandits, and detective novels. And there's one story that O'Cahill writes that's actually set in the city of Chicago that somewhat taps into this kind of popularity of detective novels. And it's the last story, or one of the last stories that he actually wrote. So we can see that he's attempting to adapt a little bit to what was popular in the American market as well. And that being said, and I can talk a little bit maybe during Q&A of who his desired audience was, who he was trying to aim these stories at as well. But the stories themselves can be divided into roughly two distinctive periods. The first three stories depict incidents in the Southwest, as I mentioned, during an unspecified time, but presumably the mid to late 1860s. And on that note, I suppose a common issue for me when I was translating these stories and attempting to kind of historically contextualize them as well was Eoin O'Cahill he doesn't provide a lot of details in some respects. While he does give kind of these great descriptions of the landscape, he doesn't mention specific historical figures. He does mention places, in fairness to him, but he doesn't mention a lot of dates, things that we can't kind of nail down, so to speak. But despite this, I was able to, in some instances, kind of work out that these stories, these first three, were set between 1868 and 69. And I'll just tell you how I did that. And it's one of the stories, Courtier, Texas, or kind of Trip to Texas. He comes into contact with a runaway slave who is being kept against their will on a plantation in rural Texas. And you might be saying a runaway slave in 1868 to 69 sounds a little bit strange, but his former master didn't accept the result of the late war as a part of the story. And in one line, seemingly an innocuous enough line, Cathail asks the slave, "Didn't you know that all the slaves were freed according to the laws of this country going on 6 years now?" So taking that as the Emancipation Proclamation in the beginning of 1863, we could somewhat decipher there that it was between the end of 1868 and the beginning of 1869. And there's some other details kind of sprinkled throughout the stories as well that would kind of support that time frame. So these stories are very much similar to the dime novels that we see here on the left. They're marked by fierce clashes with Native American tribes and include a number of other popular dime novel plots, including epic horsemanship, daring escapes, and in one instance, the rescue of a young girl in what is a formulaic captivity narrative. So I'm sure we've all read captivity narratives at least once or twice, especially those who have gone through the American education system. I know that they were definitely on the curriculum. There's a few on the curriculum for quite a while. But from the 17th century, really to the late 19th century, the end of the 19th century, the captivity narrative is the kind of most popular trope in American literature. And even, running to the present day in film, we have The Searchers with John Wayne and John Ford, comes out in 1956. That's a formulaic captivity narrative. And The News of the World, most recently with Tom Hanks. I just watched that with the father-in-law there a couple of weeks ago, but I think that just came out within the past couple of months. And that's very much kind of your formulaic kind of captivity narrative as well. So I'll just give an example from a story entitled Immersion leis na Hindi, or Conflict with the Indians, which contains a bit of all of the above, all of these kind of plots, and then some. It's a wild story, but this was one of the instances in which I was able to pretty definitively pinpoint where Cathail was drawing off of a Buffalo Bill Cody, like we see here, plot, and to actually find which plot I think that he was drawing off of. So I'll give you the Cathail text, a little excerpt, and then I'll give you a bit of the Buffalo Bill Cody, and then you just can make your mind up how close it is. So in the Cathail version, he describes an episode in which he, like Cody, is working as a dispatch rider, bringing messages between outposts, and he doesn't serve this role anywhere else in his stories. After a small skirmish with an Indian war party, he and his companion have to swim across a deep river in pretty horrendous weather conditions. It's hailing, it's raining, it's snowing. He's crawling across. They're wet. They're upset. It's horrendous. And then they run into an unforeseen circumstance. Now, even given my spoiler alert before, I won't give away what that circumstance that they run into is. You'll have to read it and find out. But after they finally arrive at their destination and deliver their message to the commanding officer, Cathail notes, quote, "We went to the commander's office and I gave him the letter. And he after he had looked through it, he asked me, 'Is the time frame in this letter correct? That it only took 4 days to get here from Texas? If that is true, you made the trip quicker than it's ever been done by any other rider in this country.' When I told him that it was correct and that the Indians had delayed us, he was astonished. We thought that there weren't any Indians on this side of the Rocky Mountains." So now let's cut over to the Buffalo Bill version, as contained in James W. Boyle's biography of the well-known scout. And I was able to piece together as well that Ocaro was actually a fan of James W. Boyle. So he mentions a different text that Boyle had written, and he calls him the learned sage. He doesn't mention him by name, but he passes off a paragraph of Boyle's in a private letter as his own. On religion. So mad stuff. But this is from the Boyle version, depicting one instance in which Cody is delivering a dispatch between Fort Larned and Fort Hays in Kansas. Boyle notes, quote, "General Sheridan was profoundly astonished," so same word there as well, "to see Bill before him again in so short a time. And after being informed of his wonderful riding during the 3 days, the general pronounced it a feat that was never equaled, even now. General Sheridan maintains that no other man could accomplish the same distance under similar circumstances. When it is considered that all this distance, 358 miles in 58 hours, was made during the nighttime and through a country full of hostile Indians, without road to follow or a bridge to cross the streams. So, like O'Cahill's version, Cody actually has to swim through a few streams as well in Boyle's version. This feat appears too incredulous for belief. So I'll let you kind of decide for yourselves how close that is, but there's a few other kind of instances in the story that read quite close. So O'Cahill's remaining stories are all reflective of life, as I mentioned, in the upper Midwest, mainly in Michigan and in Minnesota, but also one or two set in Chicago. And these are all kind of moralistic, sentimental tales centered around a chivalric frontiersman. And this is a role that O'Cahill often depicts himself as. So kind of these descendants of Leatherstocking, as if they've been referred by some scholars. And in these kind of depictions, he's often employed in the booming lumber trade of the region, and this kind of brings him around to different areas and in contact with different individuals. So within these later tales, he often invokes Irish history and mythology to describe the events transpiring around him. And this is something that we don't see in the earlier southwestern stories. For example, he compares the whole-scale slaughter of wolves in the region, owing to the bounty paid by the government for wolves' ears at that time, to the carnage described in battle scenes of Fionn McCool and the Fianna of Irish lore. And similarly, he situates his preoccupation, right, with a constant interest in deforestation and urbanization, with the destruction of Ireland's forests during the 17th century. And he makes specific mention of the Jacobite lament, the Clean Kilcosh. So if you have any musicians here, you'll know that beautiful and kind of haunting lament. So here's another excerpt from a story called Fudrach Mara Biog Ní Linn Ag Mahún Samlian Ach Jeg Shaska Shacht in Nard the Ishka Glasta, Michigan. So the abduction of little Mara Ní Linn by a bear near Pentwater, Michigan in 1867. And he notes, quote, "This side of the country is now like Kilcosh. The woods have all been felled to my great sorrow. The roots of the trees are torn out and burnt. Foolish people are buying coal now. There is no shelter for the deer, bears, wolves, or wildcats in this part of the country now. Instead, there are fine houses and barns everywhere. The nicest roads in the world are now found in this country. They are all made of cement, thanks to the automobiles. There's a major difference between the roads here nowadays and the roads 60 years ago. There was only one horse in this county when I first came," a bit like Loud, "but there were oxen then and for years after. After the oxen came the horses. Horses are scarce now. Almost every family in the county has an automobile." So there's one kind of example of these sentimental reflections of an Irish immigrant looking back on the 60 years that he spent in the country and on the changes, both technological and even social and environmentally, that have occurred during that time. And what's really fascinating is O'Cahill, these are kind of peppered throughout these later stories of his, but they're not necessarily connected to the stories themselves. So they're not central to the plots, but one would argue, especially from a historical perspective, that these are some of the most important elements of these stories. And as I mentioned, another persistent theme in O'Cahill's works, and there again we see, these are actually the raw kind of manuscripts that I was working on. So just one note that you'll see here is not only the Clo Gaelic that he was writing in, beautiful kind of penmanship, but also there's no quotation marks or inverted commas anywhere in there. So in the editing process of working on this, I had to kind of decipher who was actually speaking at times, because he has no punctuation in some instances. There's no kind of indicants of the speaker. So even this, as I mentioned, the kind of oral tradition of West Limerick, his texts are very much reflective of the oral tradition as well. They read like somebody is just transcribing a story that's being told to him. So this is very much kind of central to his style. There's the man himself. We'll bring him to life there. a little bit. But as I mentioned, another persistent theme throughout the stories is the value of multilingualism. In more than one instance, O'Cathill's own knowledge of French, he was actually multilingual in Irish, French, and English, helps him navigate certain situations. While in the one story, there's actually one story I kind of slipped in cheekily, I suppose, that's not penned by O'Cathil within this volume, but it's actually written by Tomás O'Neill Rothschild, a big Gaelic leaguer. And he's a fascinating character in his own right for those that aren't familiar with him. Unlike O'Cathil, who doesn't really have a great interest in Irish republicanism, O'Neill Rothschild actually escapes to the United States in 1867, flees, because he's afraid he's going to be imprisoned in Ireland for his involvement in the Fenian movement. He's a journalist in Ireland, writing for the Irishman and a couple of other papers. And around the time of the Fenian Rising, he leaves and goes to America. He is involved with Fenianism there for a short time, but his real passion is the Irish language, and that's really what he becomes the most involved with in his kind of life in the United States. He eventually goes back to Ireland and helps found the Gaelic League, and he's a fascinating character. But in the one story that he wrote in that volume, the narrator's knowledge of Irish actually saves his life and the lives of his whole kind of party. He's a 49er going to California in 1849 for the gold rush. So it's in the title of the story, so no kind of spoiler there, but it's a fascinating story, and the main character is actually named O'Mahony as well, so he's a Mahoney, we'll claim him. And that brings us to the all-important question of Eoin O'Cathil's background in relationship with the Irish language and why he chose to write these stories through Irish. This is particularly fascinating, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, given that he wasn't a native speaker of the language. And of his own early linguistic development in West Limerick, he notes, and I'll give you the Irish here, and then I'll give you the English then. So he writes, Nervias Carabina Jagdish, the Tishkinch Woyagam and Chanchanga, K na Rinasi Alorch, the Gile Galif Egna Shandini, August Berla Brishta Egna Dini Uga. So when I was 14 years old, I had a good understanding of the Irish language, although I did not speak it. The old people all had fluent Irish, and the young people had broken English. So taking, I suppose, that into account, we look at the 1851 census, and it offers a snapshot into the Irish language and the status of the Irish language in O'Cathil's native West Limerick at that time. And it shows that 60% of the adult population in 1851 spoke Irish. A much higher figure, you might note, than the provincial 43.9% in Munster and the national figure of 29.1%. And we have to remember that Irish at that time is in decline. And this is something that picks up steam as the 19th century goes on. But Eoin O'Cathil, being born in 1840, he was 11 years old when those statistics were kind of reflective of the community. So despite his strong early footing in Irish, it wasn't until he emigrated to the United States that O'Cathil fully recognizes the correlation between language and identity. And I think this is still often the case. And I've talked to O'Cathil a good few times in the past couple of months, and we've had kind of great, fruitful discussion on this topic. But I think Elizabeth can certainly speak to this, that even in today's kind of, context, I think whether it be language or some other aspect of one's culture, one often becomes much more, say, Irish when they leave Ireland, maybe than when they're here, right? Whether it's Gaelic games or the Irish language or even Irish history or whatnot. So on this point, confiding in Douglas Hyde, he conveyed his shame and disappointment at the lack of Irish spoken by himself and other Irish immigrants when he arrived in the United States. And he notes, Nor haname ga Jean Tirsha, haname gak Kenya Sadoan a Lorch a Jenga Hien, At na Herni agus na Lachlinig film, Hanig Naira Erinach Gleakurum Hien, Agus nach Rosanoun Changa Mahin Shore Lorch. So when I came to this country, I saw every race in the world spoke their own language, save for the Irish and the Scandinavians. I was ashamed to call myself an Irishman, and yet I couldn't speak the language of my ancestors. Mm-hmm. So luckily for O'Cathil, and luckily for us as readers, he quickly went about attempting to rectify the situation. And through a couple of his different letters and even through his stories as well, his kind of Churchanga, or his linguistic journey, comes into a clear focus for us. So I'll just kind of run through some of his linguistic development here. And Elizabeth would be happy to know there's a Kerry connection in there. There always is,
Of course.
so there has to be. So that'll come in a minute or so. So as mentioned, his kind of creativity blossoms when he's stationed in Little Rock, Arkansas. But it's kind of where his linguistic development really starts as well, which is perhaps not coincidental. He comes into contact there with Tommaso Grada, who's a native Irish speaker from Little Bighorn in County Clare. And at the time, Tommaso Grada was serving in the 9th Kansas Cavalry, who were also stationed in Little Rock, and they were disbanded then later in the summer of 1865. So this friendship, from what we see, has a profound impact on O'Cathal, and O'Grada is actually depicted as the hero in O'Cathal's, and I'll just go back to that poem there on the left. In these poems, these kind of epic poems, O'Grada is depicted as a hero, very much in the style of Buffalo Bill Cody. Kind of a Gaelic Buffalo Bill, if you want to say that. And these are actually all long captivity narratives. So he's very much taken with that kind of trope of American literature. And they recall the two men, O'Cathal and O'Grada, being held by hostile native tribes in the Rocky Mountains and how they escaped from their captivity there. And it's during his time recovering from his illness that we mentioned that he relocates from Little Rock to Chicago and stays with his sister. And it's during this period that he makes the acquaintance of Mcgirman, who is a native Irish speaker from County Mayo. And O'Cathal describes him as a Gaelic scholar who owned a number of manuscripts. And luckily for him, while he's recouping, it appears that Mcgirman actually seemingly lent O'Cathal a manuscript of Oisin and Niamh and Tír na nÓg. So this is kind of where his interest in the Fianna and the stories of Oisin and Niamh, and he actually describes Pentwater, Michigan, or Uisce Glasta as looking just like Tír na nÓg as Oisin described it in summertime, when all the fruit is blooming and the birds are singing, and it's the kind of land of eternal youth. So he's given a copy, and O'Cathal transcribes his own copy in a notebook of this manuscript. And this remains one of his prized possessions throughout his life, and certainly had an impact on his own writings, from the structure of his poetry to the content of his prose, where he's describing these kind of epic battles that compare to Oisin and Fionn and the Fianna. So when he returns to Chicago, then after going back to Michigan as a member of the police force in 1873, he comes into contact with an Irish speaker from Connemara, Martin O'Brennan, with whom he recalled he never spoke a word of English. And O'Cathal, he kind of later says that his conversations with O'Brennan gave him a major boost in terms of his confidence and his spoken ability in the language. He outlines similar experiences when he returns to Michigan, and when he had first moved there as well. First with Kildare man Donal Moriarty, who was a professor of Greek in Ann Arbor College, and later at the University of Michigan, and Padraig O'Neill, who is from West Kerry. And O'Neill comes to Pentwater originally as a foreman on the railroad. So he's working when they're building the railroad there, and then he stays in the town. And O'Cathal remarks that they both taught him a good bit of Irish, and both subsequently helped boost his confidence in his spoken Irish. But I think we can say that the biggest influence, and this is mentioned both in his nonfiction prose and in one of his short stories as well, the biggest influence on O'Cathal's linguistic development was Father Owen Ocaro. And he was the pastor of St. Thomas Church in Chicago from 1887 to 1916. And he was very much involved in the Gaelic League of America and the Irish Revival in the United States. And he was elected the librarian of the Gaelic League unanimously in 1901, the Gaelic League of America, that is, in 1901. And Ocaro was renowned for hosting an Irish language mass every St. Patrick's Day. So much like some of these Irish American events that go on year by year and kind of become rich traditions in places like New York or even Chicago itself, this is one of them at the turn of the 20th century. And Ocaro it famously, again, for someone else there, furnished himself with a typewriter that had the Clo Gaelic. So that kind of text that we saw from the Ocaro writing in there, or the Gaelic typescript. And as part of the Mass, he would provide the congregation with copies of the parts of the Mass and his homily in both the original Irish, and then in kind of I think a little bit of a nudge to the Berlahori, or to the English speakers, he'd give a really rough translation in English as well, but it wasn't the kind of rich Irish language version of the original. And O'Cahill actually attended one of these celebrations, which he writes about in a short story. And more importantly, perhaps, he credits. He talks about, it was one of the most brilliant days of his kind of existence in the United States, but he credits Ocaro as well with making him aware of the Gaelic Revival taking place in Ireland and putting him in touch with the leading individuals of the Gaelic Revival in Ireland at the time. So I suppose more importantly, right, this kind of allows Owen to enter into the kind of world of transatlantic, of the transatlantic or transnational Gaelic print culture, which is really kind of blossoming at that time. And I suppose the rest, as they say, is history, as O'Cahill then begins writing into on Clive Solish, the organ of the Gaelic League. And very shortly after, he begins kind of putting down his autobiographical stories of life on the American frontier. And I would argue probably that the stories were actually written much earlier, but that he was, just putting them down. So kind of moving along, because it's on Cloggy Brahram and Shaw, but one of the other kind of interesting bits that's included within both the volume and O'Cahill's manuscripts is that he actually made a dictionary, right, for his intended readership of both region-specific terms and general terms that were meant to kind of help them navigate through his attempts in Irish. So I'll just actually run through a few of these terms. And as we see, there's some that are kind of run-of-the-mill words that we still use in Irish, like liachan for an ambush, right? But then there are other words that I suppose at the time when I was going through and translating these, my wife and I would kind of call Cahillisms. I would sometimes kind of excitedly shout across the room some O'Cahillism to her, that was just something either kind of fascinating or bizarre that he'd come up with for historical figures, historical events, regional kind of terms. So I'll just give you a few of those as well. So one is kind of Glimniafad Raurakak for binoculars, and looking at the which isn't too bizarre, I suppose, but this is significant because in the O'Neill Russell story, he actually has his own word as well, which is quite similar for a telescope. So he has telescope as Glimniafad Aurakak. So just the last word there is Raurakak and Aurakak, so they've kind of swapped those, but of note. Then some of the more kind of interesting entries from O'Cahill, Flash Nishelgaracht for Indian's Heaven, and of course these are O'Cahill's translations, not my own. Flash Nishelgaracht for Indian's Heaven, or the Happy Hunting Grounds, which is a common term in dime novels of the time, and in both settler and native accounts as well. We see that term crop up. And Fuelku and Wakara for coyote or a prairie wolf. Ahar Moor Fionn, and he has that as an Indian pet name for the president. So maybe we could break that one out for Joe Biden these days. And Our Gug War for the Little Bighorn. And I think that last one is really fascinating because the story of the Little Bighorn is kind of central. He has it in his dictionary with a little description of what the Little Bighorn was, presumably for Irish readers. But we do see it crop up in probably the most well-known Irish language text to come out of the United States, in the kind of early mid 20th century, Mickey McGowan's Rowan and Teal. And he actually says that he, heard hundreds of stories during his time going to the Klondike, and he writes about his trip to the Klondike and everywhere in between. But he says that he heard many stories of Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn and the kind of continued place that had within American social memory. So it's interesting that both of these kind of Irish language writers, placed the Little Bighorn within their writings. But then also in the case of O'Cahill, his recollection of it isn't completely passive. In his poetry, he actually depicts himself and Tommaso Grada as members of the cavalry force that are sent out to avenge the death of Custer. And this is, again, in terms of the dime novel, really significant, and in terms of Buffalo Bill Cody, really significant, because that's a central motif of Buffalo Bill's kind of persona, right? So by the stage in 1876, when Custer's defeated, Buffalo Bill is running a stage show in New York. He gets the news, everybody gets the news back east, and he takes a break from the stage, rejoins the military as a scout, and goes out west. And he actually gets into a small skirmish with a war party and kills a sub chief called Yellow Hair. And Cody scalps Yellow Hair, brings the scalp back east, and makes that a central motif of his stage show. And actually, it's the climax of his new stage show, and he holds up the real scalp as the climax. So O'Cahil definitely kind of draws on this avenging Custer kind of storyline, which was very, very popular amongst dime novels at the time. And he depicts himself as a similar member of the force sent out to avenge Custer. What we do know is that by that stage, almost by that stage, well, O'Cahil was finishing his time in the Chicago police force. So he might have been facing down some kind of intimidating characters, but they were not Sioux Indians. They were probably people on the street in Chicago. And he was going back to Pentwater, Michigan. So he wasn't in the military at that stage at all. So I'll just actually end on this quote here. And this is a quote that I have towards the end of my kind of short intro in the text as well. It's from the Kenyan writer and academic Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in which he notes, quote, "Language as culture is the collective memory bank of a people's experience in history, which transmits or imparts those images of the world and reality through the spoken and the written language, that is, through a specific language." So viewing language in this light, the bilingual kind of nature of the work that was carried out was of the utmost importance. And when I was approaching kind of different publishers or just kind of putting the feelers out, there was a lot of kind of places that said, look, we'd be interested in publishing translations, but we don't want the original Irish. Edited or not, we don't want the original Irish. It's not marketable or whatnot. The University of North Texas were brilliant in that immediately they said, yeah, no bother. We've published Spanish text, we've published French text. Irish is no different. That gives us a specific view of the world. And immediately I thought of Ngugi wa Thiong'o in this quote and a few other quotes from him and the likes of Frantz Fanon as well. So it's my hope that the collection and O'Cahil's writings will enable scholars without a working knowledge of Irish to utilize sources which present the unique outlook, as Wa Thiong'o says here, of an Irish speaker in the American Southwest and Upper Midwest, and will also allow scholars who do read Irish to kind of engage with these kind of what were rough manuscripts, to engage these stories and to include it within their own scholarship as well. So fágam é an sin é agus fáilte ribh é an ceistine. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll leave it there. So go me and Wahid.
Garth Mila Mahagut, that was brilliant. Honestly, very I thought very interesting and he's a complicated character, I was struck as an immigrant myself, and I think you referenced it in your talk too, about becoming more Irish kind of when you're over here than when you were at home. And that's an interesting viewpoint. But I think too, he's sort of very much a person of his time, because he's basing so much of what he's writing, on kind of the accepted wisdom, particularly around, the natives and Custer. But isn't he also kind of, it seems, a little bit forward thinking, like in terms of the environmentalism awareness? And I know that that's the wrong word, to use, because he wouldn't have been aware of it in that context as such. But he seems to be very much, even though, like as you said, he's lamenting maybe because Ireland had seen the passing of its forests, and its wildlife. So he might be looking at it through that kind of transnational scope. But he seems to be very of his time, and yet at the same time kind of prescient on some issues, I think. But I don't know. Did you get that sense of him, Padraig, like that he was very well-rounded,
Yeah, no, that's actually a brilliant kind of observation there, because I mean that was my exact thought when I was first reading these texts. Or in one moment you're looking at him and you're thinking, wow, this is like even his views on Native Americans. And Douglas Hyde has a great quote that he mentioned in a letter to his daughter, and he says, your father was a great man, and he was always on the side of the oppressed, whether it was the poor Irish tenant or the Red Indian. He always stood with the oppressed. And in looking specifically at his stories, it's kind of tough to see that on occasion, because he'll have these stories of Native American massacring Native Americans with like superior military technology, and obviously he's a man of his time, he wouldn't have seen that. But then there were other stories, mainly these ones in the Midwest, where he actually speaks of Native American culture and tribes very favorably and their way of life. There's one instance in which there's one of his characters, a French character, actually talks about kind of the white settlers of the area. And he says, I'm forever separate. I'm going to separate from my own race forever. These white blood suckers. They have no values, and they're pious, but they don't live, a kind of a wholesome life. And he goes off and lives with a Native American tribe. And then obviously with the environment as well, he's involved in the lumber trade as an active member of the lumber trade, but then he also has these observations where they are very sentimental, and where he's very much ahead of his time in kind of seeing the effect that this is having on his environment. So as you say, he's just a complex character in that regard. But yeah,
he sounds fascinating. Jack, did you have a question there? Oh, you muted yourself. No, unmute yourself, Jack. Yeah, I know. Good. Okay, tell us. Let's start again.
Oh, I didn't have a question, Elizabeth. I was just for possibility. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Bob says fascinating and very interesting. And yeah, lovely to hear you speaking Irish. Thank you. Is that an Ulster dialect you have, Padraig? Or
it is indeed, yeah.
It's a tricky one, lads. I have Munster, so it's way easier. But, and Jeannie Mac, I don't know how you read the old stuff. I recognise she Griha there, or it's the, like, it means fairy wind, or you translated it as whirlwind or tornado or something. But that script for me is impossible, because they do a dot over things for an H. I can't do it.
Yeah, no, the old dialect, and even O'Connell, sometimes his spellings are a bit funny, and like I suppose he's working off of, I suppose, words that he would have even heard at times. So sometimes he's
or he would never have seen them written. Peter says on Facebook, what were the scope of his Western travels? Montana, Kansas, California, or where did he go?
Yeah, brilliant question, Peter. Thanks for that. It's tough to tell, to be honest with you. His sister lives in Colorado, so presumably he would have gone out to Colorado, but he doesn't actually specifically mention any trips. He does mention going to Texas, kind of North Texas. He does. Well, I suppose I shouldn't say that. He does mention Colorado in his poetry, but his poetry is very much like, I suppose, more so than his prose writings. It's very fanciful. It doesn't hold up under, historical scrutiny. It is very much his attempt to kind of emulate these stories of the Fionn cycle. But yeah, I would say, I mean, we can definitely say he was in Chicago. He was in Texas. He was in Arkansas. He was in St. Louis. And these are the places that he mentions anyway. But he does, in one instance of talking to Florence Johns, actually the niece who was an actress, he talks about an instance in which her mom was actually quite guilty because she hadn't baptized her children, and one of her sons had died. He was kicked by a horse, and he died before he was baptized. And Ocaro does mention there that he kind of, took her aside and gave this whole kind of dialogue on religion and how it was hypocritical and not to worry about it. And so, I mean, presumably we can say he was in Colorado at that stage, but there's no evidence to say that he was in Montana or, farther afield. Although he says he was in the Philippines, and he was in the Philippines, and he traveled all over the world and everything.
Yeah, well, there is the connection to Blarney there, like. Yeah. He, we have ordered copies of the book, so it should be in. We're waiting on. We've had about 10 books that we've ordered, multiple copies of, because of all these talks that we're giving lately, or that we're hosting lately. So it should be in, and you can order it through us. But I think, do you know how popular his stuff was in Ireland? Sure, they must have eaten it up. The kind of cowboy and Indian narrative at home must have been very exciting. Like,
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I suppose it's actually kind of a sad one as well. Unintentionally sad, but he sent the writings back to Douglas Hyde, a number of his writings back to Douglas Hyde, and he was hoping to have them published. So An, the government agency for Irish language printing, was founded in 1926, after the establishment of the Free State, and he is thinking, and he says this to Florence again, and also to Douglas Hyde, and his daughter says it to Hyde in the letter after Owen passes away in 1928, that he was hoping to see his works in print in Ireland. And he kind of imagines this Gaelic readership that is going to eat him up, because there are stories of, the cavalry fighting Indians and kind of frontier tales, and as I say, that kind of level of escapism and kind of the classic kind of frontier and dime novel stories are really popular in Ireland, even though they've already they're past their sell date in the US market.
Yeah.
In Ireland, they're popular up through the 40s and 50s, but especially popular in the kind of mid to late 1920s and early 30s. So he's hoping to see him in print, but Douglas Hyde sends them on, according to his account, to the An office, and they're read by two different kind of peer reviewers, and they decide not to publish them. And the reasons for this, Hyde says anyway, is because of, and as you know, the kind of old spellings, old idioms, kind of dialectical things. He's writing in kind of the old kind of Munster Irish of West Limerick of his time.
Yeah.
So Hyde just says, look, and there are a lot of funny things as well that we can't really blame on dialect, and we can't blame on even the period. Like, he very rarely used the kind of genitive case, the Tishel Genitive. And there's some other kind of grammatical things within his Irish that Hyde says would, that's why they rejected him. But he was
kind of self-taught, I suppose, Yeah. So it's interesting too about Templeglanton isn't far. I'm from Listowel, in Kerry, so it's not far. But I was thinking it might be part of that Slieve Lucra kind of because when you said about the census, like, and the fact that Irish there was strong, where kind of in other parts of the county it wouldn't be. They have a very strong, like, traditional, music and all of that culture. So parts of Kerry, Limerick and Cork in that band would be very similar, so it's interesting. Yeah. Did anyone else on Facebook or Zoom have a question or a comment?
I just had a comment, and I just wanted to thank you for including the text and seeing his handwriting. It's fascinating and beautiful, and it's just so rich. I'm just amazed, really. And then particularly when you showed the text of his poetry,
I can actually
amazing.
Go back to that.
Beautiful.
Yeah, the penmanship, my God, like.
Yeah.
We don't write like that. Well, I speak for myself. I certainly don't write like that anymore. And I was a teacher for how many years? Yeah, illegible I am. Wonderful. Anyone else have a question or comment? There's nobody commenting on Facebook, I think, but we have a few in there. So, no, Padraig, I think it's an amazing, little snapshot of, an immigrant who, he never goes back home, obviously. Like, he kind of does make America be home. And it's, of course, a lot of his siblings, it sounds like maybe most of the siblings are out here too. Funny, he left the children at home from the first marriage. She must have died, did she, the wife, or the...
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I don't think she actually did die until years later.
Okay.
She's quite a bit older, I think, than Eoin Ua Cathail. And there's actually a great master's thesis on some of his poetry from Emigrant Galway, but she kind of unpacks a bit about the family history in Ireland, because she's more concerned with his life in Ireland. But yeah, it would appear that the wife was alive for quite a while after Owen went to the US. But it is fascinating, as you mentioned, I suppose, just that he very much makes America his home. And as I mentioned during the talk, he was very much kind of an American nationalist. And it's interesting when you look at a lot of these kind of early, Gaelic Leaguers, the Gaelic League of America. There's another fellow actually in Springfield, Massachusetts, Pádraig Ó Hagóide, who's from South Kerry. Wrote the great Óchan Donacha, the poem, and Lament. But he he as well, I suppose, like they one thing that struck me about O'Cahill, and then looking at Pádraig Higgert as well, he does the same thing, is that they use when they're writing back to Ireland, say in like the Clive Solish, they use the third person plural instead of using the first person plural.
So more formal kind of.
Well, which is it's a small thing, but like they would say, like you guys in Ireland, like, or like you Irish are doing this, but even though they're born in Ireland, raised in Ireland, and they're Irish speakers, and they've moved to the United States, in O'Cahill's case, and it's actually contained in the volume here because it was just too fascinating not to put it in, but his commentary on the Spanish-American War, and in particular, even President McKinley, he's responding to an editorial written by a kind of top Gaelic leaguer in Ireland at the time. And it's very much like, oh, you Irish over there are misinformed about this conflict, and you know what, like American intervention is going to be great for Cuba, it's going to be great for the Philippines, and you know when we're all, you know, when all is said and done here and the dust settles, like they're going to have the type of governments that I want to see in Ireland, like, so
yeah, and it's not imperialism when we do it.
yeah. It was very much like he was kind of one of these individuals that, you know, emigrated in the 1860s, kind of bought into that rhetoric of like this kind of spreading American republicanism and Republican institutions across the world, and stuck with it then. So it wasn't imperialism when we were doing it, and
stayed just quiet about the Irish War of Independence. That's fascinating. Like he must have been undecided about how he felt. You know, maybe he wasn't as supportive as other people would have liked him to be. Maybe. Yeah.
It's certainly a possibility, and I mean, he does address his letters to the Irish Free State after its establishment, which probably doesn't say much, but there is just it's a glaring silence, because in a few letters to Hyde, he's actually writing right in the aftermath of 1916, and he doesn't mention it at all. Even as a
or 1920 when De Valera is out here, you know, like,
or there's no commentary on De Valera or.
Just as well. I'm a Michael Collins woman. So this comes up every time. It's amazing the way we can bring in all those themes in every talk. Kerry is always mentioned, and De Valera v. Collins is always mentioned. So if no one has any other questions or comments, we'll let you go. I know it's early morning kind of for you there now. But thank you very much. I think, you know, when I get the book in, I'll let you all know, and you can order from us. We'll mail it out to you. And but yeah, an absolutely fascinating book. Best of luck with it. And I think it's such an important, because it's like we can nearly name them on one hand, Pádraig, you know, so to be able to talk about an Irish immigrant who's writing in Irish about life in America, you know, in the 19th and early 20th century, I think it's, and especially this guy's point of view, because he's not, you know, he isn't involved in Irish politics. It's America that he's kind of commenting on. So I think that's absolutely fascinating, and kind of rounds out the picture that we have of immigrants. Oh, Bob, were you coming in with a question?
No, I was just turning the camera on.
Okay, good, no problem. Yeah, you're lovely. Okay, good. So thank you everyone for joining us, and Pádraig, again, thank you so much. It was great having you, and we might have you back on later on to talk about your other book, the Civil War. Was it Civil War in Connecticut? Yeah.
There's a good bit of Michael Collins and De Valera in there, so.
Yeah, good. Well, right up my street, and there's surely a Kerryman. So.
There's a good few Kerrymen in there as well. Just on note as well, I do have my contact details there. If anybody has any questions or comments or anything, I'll just leave that up for a second, and feel free to shoot me a message.
And you can contact me at the museum too if you haven't seen it, but his email, is right there. Oh, top watch your oats, Deirdre. You're very good at the Gaelic. It's because some of you guys, I think, are taking classes, you know. So the Ulster dialect is very popular, Pádraig, out here. We have a local in Albany, anyway. You know, there's quite a few classes at the Celtic Hall, and it is all Ulster dialect, like Guidor, you know, Ulster.
Oh, okay, that's
very cool. Specific, you know. Yeah.
Is there somebody from Guidor living out there, or is kind of?
No, I don't think so. I think Sir Sheen just learnt it from someone, and is actually studying now online with somebody maybe back in Guidor. But yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so I think you'll have a couple of emails there from people, but it was absolutely fascinating. We'll definitely have you back. We'll probably, you saw the June newsletter. We have a few too many events in June. I was trying to cut back. So we'll definitely keep July and August a bit quieter, maybe only do one a week. And because I know people will be enjoying, if we ever get it again, fine weather. It's raining tonight in Albany. But so
we stole
we'll have
the fine weather here.
I know, yeah, exactly. The world
days,
is topsy-turvy. Yeah. So we'll have you back in the fall for sure to talk about your other book. And enjoy Ireland. And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. I'm delighted to see you.
Thank you, Patrick. Very enjoyable.
Thank you, Dan.
Good. Take care, guys. Stay safe. Thank you.